Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I'd just like to thank the CHERISH team for giving us the opportunity to talk about a project that myself and two colleagues, Danielle Newman and Lawrence Northall, have been working on for the last year. It's called Mapping Memories, and it's looking at a community approach to coastal change on Mersey Island in Essex. Now, just to give you an idea of why the three of us are working on this, we're all part of CITiZAN, the Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeological Network, and for the last 5 years now we've been working around England trying to record or preserve by record England's fragile coastal archaeology before it's lost for good for various different reasons. But during the pandemic, during COVID, we were of course scuppered. We were unable to continue with our work, at least continue on site and in person with the fabulous network of volunteers that we've developed around the country. So how could we continue with this work, and how could we perhaps expand what it is that we did? And we were fortunate enough to see a call from the Natural Environment Research Council, which looked at creating projects that could be conducted under lockdown environments. But they had a particular slant on looking at environmental science, not just archaeology, which is what we concentrated on. But we thought that we were kind of up to the challenge of perhaps expanding the type of information, the data that we were gathering. And I've just put that quote on top of this picture here to give you an idea of the sort of thing we're used to doing, the program we're used to delivering. It's a lot of people on the foreshore, very unsocially distanced, all working together, having a great time. So we needed to come up with a way that we could continue that research without that environment being accessible. One of the things that we wanted to look at and we thought people could engage with was interesting in the changes to coastal habitats and indeed the heritage over the last 100 years. And we chose two parts of the island of Mersey Island, east and west, to concentrate our study on. And we chose them because first of all, they were kind of known to us, so they were familiar environments that even though we couldn't visit, we were aware of, but also because they were very popular with local people. A lot of archaeology has been found in those areas, and we know that quite a lot of coastal change has taken place there. So between our knowledge of the area and the locals, we were able to sort of zone in on some of the reasons perhaps why that change had been taking place. And we needed to pilot a methodology. Again, I should say again, this is a pilot study, so we had a small amount of money. It was only £10,000 to conduct this study with no access to the island itself or any physical interaction with the people that we needed to train and work with. So we came up with this idea of breaking it down in 20-year periods and trying to look at the changes along that timeline and to try to answer some particular questions, namely how the coastline of the island had changed during that time, what the factors and influences were that had brought about that change or accelerated it in some cases perhaps, but also what sort of data is available within a community for us to kind of mine and to usefully use and analyse. So we kind of thought, what could we gather? What could we collect safely? And we could set upon some three quite straightforward answers, we think, which were images. We can look at developing an image archive from the community, from people's personal collections, and of course from our partner at the Mersey Island Museum. We could look at capturing memories in the form of oral histories. So we could try to bring a little bit of colour, as it were, to the images and of course the maps that we would use from people's memories of the island. Of course, many of the community on Mersey have lived there for a large portion of their life, so are very sort of attuned to the small and large scale changes that we were interested in recording. And the last one there, we have a map, something that we have ready access to. And we divided these tasks up between the three of us, Danielle Newman taking the images, Lawrence Northall looking at recording the memories, and myself the maps. So just to couch the changes that we were going to try and explore with our volunteers into 6 indicator groups. Of course, we're an archaeology project, so first on the list is archaeology, and in all of these we were looking at kind of an absence and presence of types of activity or indeed archaeological features. The second one we looked at was cultural uses of the foreshore and how that might have changed and if it was changed as a result of how the coastline has moved. The third is looking at biodiversity, which is quite a wide topic, of course, but we were quite focused on things like seagrasses and shellfish, which are an important part of Mersey's foreshore, but also quite important in affecting the rates of change around the coastline. 4 and 5, salt marsh loss and the muds and the sediments are quite topographical elements. And lastly, it's high water lines. So over 100 years, has there been any evidence or any memorable evidence of sea level or high water lines rising? So starting with the images and the image archive that Danielle gathered, which was incredible given the circumstances. She managed to gather over 300, I think 322 images from 55 collections. 7 of those were private collections, just individuals who got in touch after promoting it through social media channels, local press, and through our own volunteer network. And the remainder of those collections came from personal collections held by Mersey Island Museum. So we're gathering all of these images. We needed to catalogue them and date them in our 20-year intervals, starting in 1920, which comes with some of its own challenges, and we had to accept them. Some degrees of margins of error, really, when looking at things. The most useful way of dating any of these was if it was written on the back of it, which came in quite a number of the cases. But for some of the images that we really wanted to use but didn't have a date for, we had to try and come up with ways of dating those and helping and the volunteers to help with that. And one of the ways that we overcame that challenge was creating a quiz to get the community involved. We would simply take the images we felt were quite information laden and that we really wanted, and give people a multiple choice option to choose the date of the image, which when you spread it over a larger number of people and you kind of take the sort of most common answer, you kind of can build up a level of trust, I suppose, in the dates that we were happy with for this early pilot study. And so once we had the images, what is it that we're looking for in them? What do we want to look for that can help us with those 6 indicators? Well, I've just kind of highlighted 4 of the things that we might have seen in this picture, looking at the depth of the salt marsh there and the state of the muds, the different vegetation that's in that image, the seaweeds that might be present, and also the lost channels and the changes in the shape of the foreshore. So for each of these images that we chose, and in the end we chose 2 images for each of the 20-year periods, purely based on a time constraint really, we started to look for the indicators in those images. And you can imagine that by simply building up that archive, we can look at a then and now for all of those. And before we even add in any oral histories or maps, you can see the significant level of change that's taken place on the island. These are effectively fixed point images in a way that the earliest images on the left fixed the point, and we tried to replicate it on the right as soon as we could go back out to the island last month. So oral histories are a second and crucial element of the project, and Lawrence managed to record about 2.5 hours of new material under lockdown restrictions, which is an achievement in itself, interviewing around 8 people from the island that were recommended to us or who volunteered through our calls. And Lawrence had to then categorize all of the information based on those indicators. And I just want to play you a little clip of Mark Dixon to give you a flavor of the type of information that people were willing to bring forward.
Certainly when going back to from the 20s and the 30s, my father used to play cricket down there. It's called the cricket field. So it has accreted. But at the same time, salt water comes on it more often. So the cricket field was with terrestrial type grasses mixed with a type of grass called Puxinalia, which is kind of one of those transition zone things. And people used to go and cut turfs there because the grass was so good. Now, if you go there now, then it's more saline species. You've got Sueda bushes, you've got Spartina. There's
Okay, so I won't play it all because it's a short presentation, but just from that little clip, you can start to get an idea of the level of detail and the colour that people and their memories can bring to a study like this. We're naming particular types of grasses, we're naming transitional grasses, so we know that there are changes in the salinity of the environment, and we know the dates roughly that these are starting to occur from.
Certainly.
The last element, of course, is mapping, and we needed to try and bring a map or an addition of a map to each of those 20-year interval periods we're studying. You can see that on the left. The ones in the middle are the ones we settled on purely because we had access to Digimap service, and really perhaps in a future study we might refine these choices and try and get some maps that are a little closely aligned with the intervals. But for the purposes of this study, this was great, and you can see the published dates and how they map, how they align, with the mapping intervals that we have. Again, straightforward map progressions will show you quite a lot. This one shows the level of longshore drift on the western end of the island. The background map is a 23 Ordnance Survey, and the light blue line on the left is the most recent survey taken in 2018, and it shows just the level of change that's taken place, even with just looking at the maps. But if we add in the pictures and we add in the oral history data, we can start to really build on that story. How did we do that? How did we add that information? This viewshed map taken quite early on, particularly of the western end of the island, shows how we plotted on each one of the photographs that we had. Each of those red V's, the apex of that V is the camera position, or where we estimate it to be, and each of those arms is the viewshed. It's what you could see from there. And you can see for that very first period, 1920 to 1940, we've got a significant amount of crossover. So we've got a really good coverage of the area that we can start to analyse. So taking into account the oral histories, the maps and the photographs, this is what we started to produce. And we'll just look at the western end of the island. This is the first interval, and you can see that we tried to add some colour to those maps, adding some polygons in a GIS, just to discuss what either we could see in the photograph or the information that was given to us from the oral histories. The red codes on the map, they align with the oral histories on the bottom. It might be a little bit small for you to see, but they're statements, they're quotes that tie specifically to this period. And the information on the right there, that is really the summary of what we found from the oral histories and from the kind of evaluating the photograph data. So in this early period, we know that we have a navigable creek, and we know that we have a less estuarine type of environment at the western end of the island. Moving on to the next interval, we found some real treasures in the photographic archive. We have this fantastic aerial archive that was unknown about really from the mid-50s, which was very handy. But we also have the sort of major weather events now playing a part in the change of the foreshore and the change of the environment. And the quote at the bottom there was great. Again, it's one of the volunteers giving some real detail to the state of the foreshore at that period in time. We continue to interval 3. You can see that we struggled to find a photograph, a second photograph at least, to fill in that period. And again, it's one of the challenges that we had to kind of overcome, and that we might change the way we do in the future. But we were left to rely more on oral histories than photographs in that instance. And again, interval 4, we're starting to get some great colour photos, but we're also starting to get mentions of things like chemicals that are used in the marine industries, in this particular case, an anti-fouling chemical, which was starting to have an effect on the flora of the foreshore, particularly on the eelgrasses that we knew to be of significance to the change on the island. And that quote, I think, really sums it up. You've got particularly strong living memories from the 80s going onwards that can really add a significant level of detail to the understanding of the maps that we have. And by the end of the period, here we are, interval 5, you can see a significantly changed foreshore in shape and in composition. The aerial survey in the bottom right of the two pictures there shows a very, very different scene to one that was described in our earlier memories, where there was lots of eelgrass binding the muds together around the island, holding the foreshore together, protecting it from erosion, from wave energy. We now have a very barren foreshore that is basically an oyster monoculture, where there were several different types of shellfish. They've since gone. The topography is much changed, and that's where we are now. So what can we measure just by looking at those things? We had our interval indicators that we were looking for, and we were looking at measuring those things by 20-year intervals. Well, we can start to estimate or guesstimate the rates of those change and look at things like the salt marsh and sediment loss, the volume of sediment that has been lost in certain areas. We can start to roughly calculate when that started happening and what amount of time it took for that change to take place. We can look, again, as archaeologists, the important thing for us is the emergence of certain features and perhaps how long they've been exposed, what they may have originally looked like that we no longer can see, and how long it takes for those features to erode in that kind of environment. We can look, as I've said, perhaps about the grasses, the rates of decline across those indicators, and also really the significant moments where great loss took place, for example, in those freezes in the 1950s. And I've just used one example of the eelgrass because I've been talking about it. On the top, you have the findings that we've got from both the pictures and from the memories. And on the bottom, we have events that we can start to tie those changes into. So we have the increased use of chemicals post Second World War. And we can see how that begins to affect the eelgrasses and subsequently affects the erosion around the coast of the island as a result of that. Also, the banning of chemicals in the late 80s and how the foreshore biodiversity slightly recovered in that area. But then on after that, we have a huge decline, which is when the archaeology starts to be revealed to us and to our project. So that's kind of a quick overview of the way we structured the project and how it generated some fantastic results. Did the community enjoy it? We think so. We had over 20 volunteers taking part in the study, which is fantastic, including, as I say, our partners, Mersey Island Museum. But really, for a pilot study, you can hopefully see the value of increasing the scale of this methodology, really, to look at different types of indicators across wider areas. And the conclusions really that we've drawn from just this small study are that, communities do witness the changes that we try to think about on a grander, longer term scale in a really unparalleled level of detail. There's a real resolution to memories and to changes that studies looking at individual aspects, again, for example, shellfish or salt marsh loss, perhaps might miss. So the wider that you open this net up to people to involve themselves and to talk about what they love, which is their home and the area around their home, the more of a detailed picture we can hopefully create to feed into wider studies looking at changes in the natural environment all around our coastline. We think it's created quite a unique data set with a huge amount of detail, with some really exciting finds in terms of photographs and image archives that no one perhaps knew about. So it's interesting to work with the community to kind of dive into that. And we know that for us as coastal archaeologists, really, it expands the potential reach and the value of the data and the studies that we're doing. We're not simply looking at the archaeological remains of the past. We're also looking at the factors involved in their revealing and in their destruction, as it were. And it offers a hugely varied way for people to get involved in an archaeology project. It's no longer just about the past. It's about things that might interest a much more varied audience all around at least Mersey Island and hopefully beyond that. It's kind of a quick chat about what we've been doing, and I hope you've enjoyed it. It's a different study for us, but one that we've certainly enjoyed immensely, and we'd look forward to expanding it to try and look at different ways that the coastlines have changed all around the Blackwater estuary and hopefully beyond that. If you have any questions about the work that we've been doing, we'd all be happy to speak to you. I'm sure there's an email address on the bottom of this slide. If you'd like to get in touch, just contact us.